It's sewing time. Hooray! Okay, so a couple of little things you need to know before we start sewing. First things first, you need to dial down your stitch length. The reason we do this is because we are sewing on paper, and if you sew at a regular stitch length, you're not going to be able to remove the paper very well when you're done sewing. So dial it down. 1.5 at least. I usually sit about 1.4, sometimes even go to 1.3, but bear in mind, that is not fun to unpick. So 1.5 is probably good. The other thing I use all the time is my finger presser. I'll show you how we use that in a minute. But there are two of the things that I highly recommend before you start foundation piecing. Okay, let's actually get on to the sewing. I have all my pieces here ready to sew. Remember we put them in order? Makes your life so much easier. I just set that down next to the sewing machine so that I can grab them as I sew. Now, the first piece is your fussy cut piece. So you want to make sure that is lined up so it is centered how you want in your teacup. You can actually use the A1 as a center reference as well, makes it easier. And remember, your fabric needs to come a 1/4 inch over, like past that dotted line. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. You can either use a pin to hold it in place or a dab of glue. I tend to use a pin just because I have them handy, but glue works a treat. Just use regular like a glue stick and that'll wash out. Okay, so next thing, we're sewing A2. Now foundation piecing, we actually put it on this side, sew on this, but we sew on this side where the lines are. So it feels a little bit backwards, but trust me, it's like magic, it works. So this line in between A1 and A2 is where we're sewing. So on here, there's the line. What you can do is you can fold your template along that line just to make a crease mark. See how there's a crease mark? Now I can see where to place my fabric. So you need to place your fabric right sides together, okay? Because when we sew this, we are going to flip it back like that. So it's right sides together. It needs to go over that line a full 1/4 inch. So you've got a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the side of the line. Then you're going to put it down with your presser foot. I like to use an open toe presser foot because it's easier to see. And the other thing I like to do is I like to back stitch at the beginning and end of each line. That's a personal preference. I know lots of people who sew past the end of the line, but I like this better. It just works for me. You only need 1 or 2 stitches at the start and the end of each one. Okay, so that's A2 sewn into place. What you're going to do here, fold the template away so you can see there, and you're just going to cut the fabric and the thread, leaving yourself a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, I like to cut it with scissors and I eyeball it because I am a lazy quilter. But if you like to be more precise, you can use an add a 1/4 ruler and a rotary cutter, and you can cut that quite precisely. This is my preferred method. You need to go with what works for you. So that is A2 in place. See, like that. Then I need A3. Remember I cut like quite a big chunk because it's a longer section. I'll have like scraps, but that doesn't bother me in the least. So I'm going to place it over there. Again, you can fold that if you need to have the crease to know where it goes. Otherwise, you can place it and kind of flip your fabric back and just make sure that it is over that section entirely, as well as the seam allowance and a 1/4 inch either end of the line. Then put it under your presser foot, and you're just going to stitch that into place. Okay, and this starts to build out. So essentially you are just sewing by number. So you just follow the numbers on the template and you can't go wrong. And you can see I've been using my finger presser here, and that just, I open that out there and then I use the finger presser. So I smooth it out with my fingers and then press it down flat with my finger presser. And that just saves you going to the iron for each section here. You don't have to do it. It will press it flat enough that you'll be fine. I do use an iron at the end. Don't worry, I'm not a complete heathen. It will get done, but at this point, I just like to do it like that. It's just easier. Now I'm going to do that big section on the side there. Just again, probably take that pin out now as we no longer need that there. So back stitch at the beginning and then at the end. Okay, and trim. Now, essentially this is the same. We're like rinse and repeat. We're doing the same thing with each section that you're adding. So that makes it nice and easy as you're working through it. This one, the cup is the easiest. The handle has some smaller parts. Again, like you're using the exact same technique. The only different thing you need to do for when you're using the smaller ones is just to take your time, make sure that you cover those sections, and again, just use those bigger pieces of fabric and you'll be absolutely fine. But take your time because some of the sections on the handle are small compared to on the actual cup, but they're very doable. The other thing I recommend is using something like Flatter, which is like a flattening spray, and you literally just spray it when you're at the iron and it will press your seams just a little bit flatter, just like it suggests. So I prefer to use that than starch, but again, personal preference. If you like starch, go for it. So I just use that. I also use Deco Bob from Wonderfill for my thread because it's a lighter weight thread and I find that it helps my seams lay flatter, which is important when it comes to foundation piecing, because if you have lots of small sections and like intersections where they join together, it can get a bit bulky. So use a lighter weight thread, use Flatter, and it'll be nice and tidy. Okay, so there's what my cup block looks like. Nice and simple. It looks messy at the moment. So what we do next is you press it with a hot, dry iron. Don't use steam because it may make the colour, the ink run on your template. So a dry iron is what I recommend. Then you take it to the mat. Using your rotary cutter on the mat, you trim along the seam allowance and then that section's done. So I'm going to go ahead and piece the handle, which it's the exact same thing, right? B1, B2, B3. We're just like working through in sequence to get it done. And I'm going to get that done and then I'll come back to you once I have pressed and ironed them and talk about how we join these sections together. Okay, so I've pieced the cup and the handle and they're looking pretty messy at the moment because we haven't trimmed the sections yet. But that reminded me, the back of this will be looking pretty messy with all those threads. Go ahead and trim those off now because it's so much easier than coming back and doing it later. So you're just giving it a quick snip. Thread snips are really great for this as well, and just trimming those threads so your block is a bit tidier. Okay, so do that, and then I'm headed over now. I'm going to give this a hot press, and then I'm going to trim them up to size so they're nice and tidy. Look at this, nice and tidy. So you can see I've trimmed back to the seam allowance. Remember, that's your sewing line. Do not trim back to there, just to the seam allowance. You need a 1/4 inch on all sides. So there's my cup, my handle, and the top and bottom sections. So when we're joining them together, you line them up here. Okay, what you can do, because we want this, when this folds out, we want the teacup handle to be straight, you can just put it down, put your fingernail on the joining line and just check that it's going to be in place and it's going to be straight. Otherwise, adjust it as you need. So you're still joining using the 1.5 or smaller stitch length. Definitely backstitch beginning and end here because these are your joining stitches to hold together. You'll need to hold this firmly because you're going over a few bumpy sections there. All right, and then trim it up. Okay, next thing you're going to do, and please do this at this stage for me, and please do it so that you continue loving foundation piecing. Remove the seam allowance paper. Just fold it back so it's got a crease and just tear it out. And this is why your smaller stitches come in handy, because this tears away nice and easily. If you leave this in until the very end, it's so much harder to remove. And also your seams sit a lot flatter once you take that out. So your seam sits like that. There's our teacup. I'm going to give it a quick press so that my seams are really flat, and then I'll add the top and the bottom. Okay, so when we add the top and bottom sections, remember they won't have paper on them because we didn't need to actually sew anything, so they're not sewed to a foundation. Just place it lined up, like the seam allowance is covered and it's lined up to the edge, and then just sew it in place with your 1/4 inch seam. Now you can sew it on the paper side or the fabric side, whichever is your preference. I use a 1/4 inch foot on my sewing machine, so that's why I just use the edge there to know that I'm getting a 1/4 inch seam. But if you don't have that on your presser foot, Maybe flip it over and sew it on the other side. Again, remove that paper out of the seam allowance. Just will make your block so much nicer if you do it now. Look at that, it's coming together. Okay, so we're just going to add our bottom section. So if you wanted to sew it on the paper side, absolutely can. It doesn't make a great deal of difference on a block this size. On bigger size blocks, you may want to have a bit of a play on that and which works better so that your fabric doesn't end up too short underneath. Okay, and then back stitch, trim, and we will remove that paper. All right, and there's my block. I'll give it a quick press and then I'll show you how it is all done. There we have it, a tiny teacup. Now, something I want to mention here, you may find your edges are a little bit raggedy here. Now these were cut precisely to size, so we know the top and bottom are correct. You just may need to trim up these sides. What happens sometimes when you're foundation piecing and you're joining sections, if your seam isn't a perfect 1/4 inch, it might not like suck the block in enough to make it this exact size. Or if your seam allowance is the opposite, then like this might be too narrow if you've done too big a seam allowance. So that's why a 1/4 inch seam allowance is quite important to make all your sections line up. With this, as long as I trim here, it'll be fine. And that's it, a tiny teacup. I can't wait to see how you make these your own.